I live in the foothills of Western NC near the base of the Blue Ridge. I lived in the mountains for a few years and I hated it up there. I despise the woods with a burning passion. Yet, just my luck, I've moved back in with my folks, in their cabin surrounded by woods. The land my family owns stretches across about 15 acres of woodland. Now, these are the woods that I grew up in, and despite my typical aversion to nature, I feel pretty safe in them. I climbed the trees and splashed in the creek and played with stick swords when I was a kid there, so these woods are sort of like home. Except for the area behind the backyard. You see, our cabin is positioned at the top of a pretty steep hill that slopes down for about half a mile before it bottoms out at a creek down in the woods. The halfway point between the house and the creek is this little patch of woods, right behind the fenced-in area around the house. It's always in shade, no thick undergrowth, just, trees. Carolina red clay, piles of leaves, the usual. But it just feels really weird down there in a way that it's hard to explain. I feel very unwelcome out behind the house, and I'm not the only one. My parents avoid it too. Even our pets, past and present, have always steered clear of it. Anyway, I'm going to share some experiences that should help to get my point across better. I was about 8 or 9 and one summer thought that I'd try camping in the backyard. I set up my family's unused tent, loaded it up with an air mattress and a pile of blankets. Copper was there too, my beloved deer stuffy, and some comic books. I guess I wanted to be excited about it, but even before the sun went down, when Mum was helping me set up my little camping trip, I just felt really uneasy. The shady patch of woods around the backyard was just weird, but I was a kid, so I figured, to heck with it. I'm 20 feet from the house anyway. I'll be fine. I was not fine. I got set up for the night, stayed up reading comics, felt like an outdoorsman, and it had barely gotten dark when I began hearing loud, rhythmic crunching in the woods behind the backyard. Like something big was walking in circles around the undergrowth. We don't have bears in my neck of the woods. Besides, whatever it was definitely walking on 2 legs. It never tried to approach the backyard, even as I sat there with Copper just listening to it. It just kept walking. In the end, I barely lasted an hour in that tent before running inside and getting into my own bed. Now, my mum is an avid gardener, and she decided one day that she was going to put together 4 or 5 raised garden beds in the backyard for herbs and veggies. This was when I was 11-ish, I think, so naturally I was roped in to help. We spent the first part of the spring just putting them together and getting them started, and I began noticing that both of us would get really edgy and irritable back there. We're best friends, and we never fight, but we'd be snapping at each other constantly, raising that garden. I also noticed for the first time that the woods behind the house were deathly quiet. Playing music or talking didn't make a difference too. It was that kind of silence that presses in on you, and it's just always back there. To our surprise though, the beds actually thrived for a little while, but Mum would always ask me to come with her when she tended to them. I thought that it was silly at the time, but when I got older, she told me that she just couldn't be down there by herself. She'd wait until I was home from school before checking on them because she too felt uneasy and unwelcome down there. Eventually, we just abandoned the project too. It got so bad, but the raised beds are still down there, just rotting away in the undergrowth. Haven't checked on them since middle school, and I'm 23 now. And lastly, and in my opinion the creepiest, was the time that I asked my mum to cut my hair. We were poorer then, so rather than go to a salon, Mum just gave me a twice-a-month trim. It was late spring and warm, so she suggested that we cut it in the backyard for easier cleanup. I was maybe 13 or 14 at this point. So we ventured down, I brought a stool and sat diligently while she cut my hair. Side note too, my mum has always cut my hair, so she's really good at it. She doesn't make mistakes, and this is important. So as she worked, we talked, and I noticed that old familiar feeling of unease again. We were not welcome back there all of a sudden, and the trees stood still and shadowy despite the brilliant sunny day, and I remember that it was just really, really cold. Mum finished up my haircut, and I shook off the extra debris to let her admire her handiwork. She stepped around in front of me, angled my head this way and that, said it looked good. And then, 3 things happened in very quick succession. First, I felt this squeeze of pressure on my lungs, like I couldn't breathe. It was such a weird sensation that I just froze. All of the uneasiness of the atmosphere pressed in on me all at once. Second, my mum got this really weird vacant look on her face. I remember her smile fading and her eyes going a little glassy, like she was lost in thought or something. And then, she reached out with the scissors, still making this empty expression, and snipped a deep cut into the skin right over my left eye. I, obviously freaked out, jumped down off the stool and backed away. At the same time, she seemed to gather herself again, and she was almost in tears. She apologized over and over again, not even bothering to take anything with us as we ran back to the house to treat the cut and stop the bleeding. I still have a little scar there, in fact, and she's never really forgiven herself for it. There wasn't even any hair hanging over that eye or anything either. I had a pixie cut at the time. So yeah, a few of the many weird experiences that makes me avoid the backyard now, and I haven't been down there in like 7 or 8 years. But now that I'm living here again, I just sometimes look into the backyard and feel that weird shudder of apprehension again. And I mean, what's the deal, right? Why don't we feel welcome in a 50 square foot patch of land that we own? Why is it so dark there all the time and quiet? I have no idea, but my parents and I just work around it and pretend like it isn't there. So my uncle's house was made from nothing, but the place where it had been abandoned for a long time before he started building. I have so many stories from that place, to me, that prove that it's indeed haunted, but I'll begin with the oldest one that I can remember, before there even was a house there. So right next to the house, there's a kindergarten there. I went there as a kid, just like my mum and her brothers before me. There was always a playground legend too about a man in a military uniform who called the kids to go behind the school and then they would disappear. Even as a kid, I remember being so afraid of going to that particular place behind the school, but as I grew, I stopped thinking about it. Fast forward a few years though, and my uncle's house had just been finished. One night, when I was out doing laundry with my cousin, I decided that I wanted to see the kindergarten from above, as it had been years since I'd seen it. So we go onto the balcony and get a really good view of the place, and after a few seconds, I noticed somebody walking in between the classrooms in the back of the school. I couldn't see their face, but my whole body tensed as I saw the shadow go through the wall and then disappear behind the school. I remembered the story from my childhood at that moment, and still wonder if that is the same man the kids saw back then. Most of the paranormal experiences that I've had, they've been with said cousin that I mentioned earlier, so I do believe her when it comes to paranormal things that she's told me that happened in my uncle's house. And one of the scariest ones for her was a time when she had just come home from school and wanted to ask her aunt, Sarah, if they were going to be eating in her grandparents' house or if they would be staying there. So she goes to the bottom of the stairs and yells, "Aunt Sarah, are you there?" To which Sarah's voice responded, "Yes." Then my cousin yelled again, "Are we going to go to Grandma's?" But nobody answered after that. After a few minutes without a response, my cousin went to the second floor and started looking for Sarah. But there was absolutely nobody there. Not a single person. She then called her on the phone, only to find out that they had all gone to her grandparents' house and were waiting for her to go as well. Well, she ran out of there and didn't come back for weeks as she was too afraid of the voice that she heard. I wasn't present when this happened, obviously, but it's important to the next story because I was there for this one. So after that, and a bunch of other paranormal things happening to her and our family, they decided that they were going to call a priest to bless the house and invited everyone to pray and later hang out with them. My family was there, 20 plus people in the backyard, as the priest blessed the house. We were all praying and singing, happy and united, when suddenly, just as the priest was going to climb the stairs to the second floor, a loud voice boomed down as if it was coming from where we were standing, and it said, "Go away." My 14-year-old self was shaking with fear instantly, but the lady that was directing the prayer yelled at us to pray louder and take each other's hands. A lot of people were crying with horror at what we had just witnessed, because it was definitely paranormal, and that has to be one of the scariest things that I've ever lived through. And because of that, I'm convinced that there is something horrible hiding in my uncle's house. When I was in my late teens, I lived with my dad. We lived in a small trailer, and at the time I smoked cigarettes, and the rule was that I was only allowed to smoke in the living room at night, not in my bedroom, because the smoke would make it to his room and wake him up. So he built a 3-way bunk bed for us when we were younger that was still in use. The top and the bottom bunks faced north, and the middle bunk faced east, and there was about 3 to 4 feet of space under the middle bunk. That was my bunk. Now, it was situated in such a way that I was lying on my back and the door was directly behind my head, which was just enough room for the door to close. I hope that I'm painting the picture right, because all of this is pretty important. So one night, I'm just watching TV in my room. It's late, so I turn everything off and lay down to sleep. I don't recall how long it was until I heard the noises begin, but I start to hear what sounds like children's footsteps go up the hallway behind me, back and forth, slowly at first, and then just quicker and quicker. Then there was some light tapping on the walls, like fingers tapping on the table along with footsteps. But then the footsteps stopped directly behind me in the doorway to my bedroom, which was about 2 or 3 feet away. And the next thing that I hear is the footsteps running into my room and under my bed. To say that I was terrified is a complete understatement. I wanted to wake up my dad, but was way too scared to yell or do anything like that, so instead I grabbed my pack of cigarettes from the TV stand that was close enough to the bed that I didn't have to move much. I lit up and I started blowing the smoke over my head into the hallway. And that did the trick. My dad woke up yelling at me for smoking in my room, and the next day he asked why I was smoking in there, when I'd never done that before, and I told him what happened. He listened intently, and when I was done, he said that he didn't understand why I was scared. You see, my dad was a staunch believer in UFOs and aliens, anything paranormal in fact, and he figured that my 2 younger brothers and I needed to know about this stuff growing up, so he told us all kinds of stories growing up. It really scared us and still affects us to this day, and we're all in our 30s now. But he thought that that was my best chance to make contact. That was my dad, though. He was never scared of the paranormal and always just intrigued. That was 20 years ago or so now, and to this day I can still remember that night like it was yesterday. For most of my childhood and adolescence, I always had weird experiences in my grandparents' home, even after they had moved out of that home. My Nana and Papa lived in the home that all of these experiences occurred in from before I was born up until around 2016, and it's my understanding that the home was built well before they moved in. The layout of the house is fairly important to most of the experiences, so I'll give a little bit of detail. There was an entryway which connected to a formal living room, the main living area, and then a zigzag hallway. Through the main living room you could get to the kitchen and the dining area, as well as my Nana's sewing room. This sewing room was also connected to the formal living room by the according doors, but they were never open. The zigzag hallway contained the master bedroom, a walk-in hall closet, my bathroom, 2 bedrooms, and my papa's study. The study and one of the bedrooms were directly across from each other, at the very end of this hallway towards the very back of the house. I guess I should preface these experiences too by saying that the dynamic of my grandparents and my family were somewhat odd. You see, my grandparents slept in separate bedrooms due to general issues, and my nana's sleep apnea machine and my disabled uncle stayed in the bedroom at the very end of the hall. My brother and I were there practically every day during the summer since my mum worked, and so most of the stories that I have come from both of us, even after I stopped staying there when I got old enough to stay home by myself. So, from a very young age, I remember always being on edge when I was there. I felt like I was always being watched and followed throughout the house, especially when I would be in that long zigzag hallway. Now, don't get me wrong, my nana was a hoarder. She hoarded almost anything and everything, but dolls were her main hoard, so I definitely had eyes on me, but this was different. My brother said that he felt the same way, but he chalked it up to being young and scared of our grandparents' crazy house. But it wasn't just feelings, though. I would swear that I would hear footsteps behind me or hear carpet crunch when I was in a room alone. Maybe my brother was right, though, and that these feelings were just us being scared kids or something. Still, a lot of other stuff happened, and it's harder to explain. I mentioned my nana was a hoarder and that she hoarded just about anything. This meant that not only was the formal living room filled with boxes and just boxes of things, but the sewing room, the hall closet, and even the main living room were also filled as well. She would go on these weird cleaning benders where she decided that my brother and I would help her sort her things, under the premise that she was trying to decide what we could sell and what we could keep. Over the years, I saw a ton of weird heirloom stuff, as well as just weird junk that she decided that she needed at one point. But one thing that really stuck out, though, was her giant ventriloquist doll. This doll, like most of her larger dolls, had its own little chair to sit in, and it was kept in this formal living room amongst the boxes. Whenever we would clean too, my brother and I would play the game of Where's Nana's ventriloquist doll because it was almost never in its chair, despite us always putting it back in the chair when we would clean. Looking back, this is something that's actually a little frightening, to be honest. My nana used a walker and had very limited mobility, so it would be impossible for her to have been moving it around. My papa never messed with stuff like that and also had limited mobility, so it wouldn't have been him either. But without fail, each time that we went looking in that room, the doll was always in a new place. Eventually, too, this doll made its way to my house whenever we moved them out of theirs, and it never left its spot in our garage, which makes me think that whatever was in my nana's house enjoyed messing with us. I say whatever was in her house because, truly, I don't know what was going on. I'm a believer in the paranormal and have had other experiences all through my life that have no connection to this house. However, there's just no real way of knowing what type of thing resides in the home because of how my nana was. She just had tons of weird stuff from random garage and estate sales that she went to, so who knows what she picked up that could have had that energy attached to it. There was also just a lot of negative energy in that house, and as someone who believes that negative energy attracts more malevolent spirits, that's another thing that I think could have influenced this house. There's a lot more that I could go on about, but I feel like I've already gone on for too long, so I'll tell the one experience that still really freaks me out almost 5 years later. So, around 2016 to 2017, we moved them out of the home because their health was pretty poor, and the house was just too large and too expensive for them to take care of it anymore. This meant that my mum and I had to clear most of it out and check up on it, since we were the only part of that side of the family that lived in the city. We had come to check up on it and remove things that my nana requested a few times before, but this particular time was different. You see, immediately upon walking in, we were hit with this terrible smell, like rot and sewage. My mum and I panicked when we smelt that smell. They were on a septic line, so it was entirely possible that there was a backup or a gas buildup that could ruin the house. However, After checking the sinks and the toilets and everywhere, we couldn't figure out what the smell was coming from because the water was running clear. My mum was convinced that it was something in the kitchen though, so she checked in there more while I went through the hall closet to find the things that we were trying to remove that day. And while I was in that closet, I felt air move by me as if someone was walking past me towards the back of the house down that hallway. Since it was a walk-in closet, I didn't really think much of it, as my mum could have just gone by me to check the bathroom that was down that hall in her quest to find the source of the smell. But about a minute or two later, from my uncle's old bedroom, I heard the very distinct sound of a suitcase zipper being pulled open. And this sound lasted what felt like forever, like it was just slowly being opened back there. After it stopped, I sort of freaked out and ran into the kitchen where I found my mum still checking the sink. Now, there was just no humanly way possible that she could have gone past me, unzipped that suitcase, and then went back to the kitchen without me running into her. So I immediately freaked out and told her what I heard. My mum is a huge skeptic, so she didn't take this to be a paranormal experience, but that someone was probably squatting in the house and I had caught them. So we pretty much left right after that. The next few times that we came before deciding to hire a trash removal company to clear the house instead of us, we never found any evidence of a squatter and we never smelt that smell again, even after not going to the house for like weeks at a time. And the real kicker to this story, the suitcase that I heard unzip was one of the things that we were meant to find and remove for my nana that day. So I had a haunting 9 years ago. I was a single mother with a 2-year-old boy and my 9-year-old niece. I had gotten custody of my niece due to her mother being an addict. We just moved into a nice apartment and I was really excited to be able to give my kids a nice place. It was newly redone, new carpet, new walls, new trim, new everything. It was a weird setup though. When you walked in, my bedroom was on the right, living room on the left, and dining room straight ahead. To the left of the dining room was the smaller bedroom, which also had its own full bathroom. I think it was more for roommates than a family. I started having paranormal encounters, though, the same day that we moved in, so I always left both bedroom doors open at night so I could see into the kids' room past the dining table. From the start, though, I would wake up at 3:12 a.m. every night. A lot of times my son would too, but would be crying. I would wake up to an old woman in my room. She would always stand in the hall that led to the master bath. She would always try to talk to me, but I could never hear her. Then my son would cry, and I would go and comfort him and go back to bed, but sleep was hard to come by for me. As time went on, she would bang on the walls and where the heater was, jiggle door handles, knock photos off the wall, wake me up every single night at 3:12. She got more and more angry too that I wasn't doing what she wanted, I think. So eventually she started appearing as a black smoke-like mass. She would get closer and closer, mumbling something that I couldn't make out. My cat would flee every time and I could just feel her anger. I could feel the tension and the frustration thick in the air. When she wasn't that black mass too, she appeared more tattered and unkempt. Her hair would be a mess when it was once done up nicely. She would look really tired, sunken in eyes, became more and more frightening. Her behavior was downright aggressive too, and the banging became so loud that even neighbors could hear it. She would rattle the doors violently. I thought someone was trying to break in at one point, but no one ever was there. My dreams were really cruel and tormented, a sort of murder, having my children kidnapped, stuff like that every night. And to be honest, there weren't many nights that I didn't cry myself to sleep. I was doing my best to raise 2 kids, one of which wasn't even mine, work a full-time job and then come home to so much negative energy. Eventually I decided to ask my neighbors about previous tenants as they'd lived there for years. And apparently a woman took care of her elderly mother here, and her mother died in my room. The apartment was totally redone because that woman literally had to wallow in her own feces. The daughter was very neglectful, and the pets were also never cleaned up after, and I also found out the reason that I was able to afford that apartment was because the rent was significantly lower than the other identical units. The manager of the apartments never told me about any of this. Anyway, shortly after I woke up again at 3:12, but instead of the old woman or blackness, I saw my son squatting on a dining room chair. I said, "Troy, why are you up?" He looked me straight in the eyes, smiled his sweet smile and whispered, "Mama." I got up to go and get him, but as I reached for him, he just vanished. My heart sank and I could barely breathe. I thought that something had happened to him, so I ran into the kids' room and they were both fine, sleeping away. I cried that night until I was so exhausted that I just fell asleep. But that's when I decided to break my lease and move out. Crazily enough too, she would unpack boxes, she would hide things, she would turn the bathroom light off when I was in the shower. She was trying desperately to talk to me and I had no idea how to listen. I mourned for her a bit. I could feel her pain, but I also had a family to take care of. I had my stuff packed and I moved in under a week. If you have any idea what it's like to be a single parent with 2 kids and a full-time job, then you know that that was an amazing feat. Oddly though, I had a really weird dream after we moved out that there was a diary hidden behind the water tank. Why I never thought to look in there when that was where she kept banging, I'll never know, but I just hope that she found peace.